I hope you can see how Christ's teaching in John chapter 14 lends support to the pre-tribulation rapture position. That position asserts that the rapture does not happen at the second coming when Christ returns to the earth to reign for 1,000 years. But instead, the position asserts that the rapture occurs before the tribulation period, where Christ comes in the air to gather his people to himself, to bring them back to heaven, to the Father's house. As we have seen, it is this coming of Christ to take his people to himself and bring them back to the Father's house that is in view in John chapter 14. Note that if my understanding of John 14 is correct, this poses a problem with the post-tribulation rapture position. For that position asserts that the rapture happens at the second coming. Opponents of this position will often cite Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, and conclude that the gathering that is spoken of is the rapture. But note that even if Matthew 24, verse 31 was indeed referring to the rapture, there's nothing in that chapter, neither in any other passage in the New Testament, that teaches that after the second coming of Christ, Christ is going to bring the raptured saints back to the Father's house in heaven, which would fulfill Christ's promise in John chapter 14. Instead, the Bible teaches that at the second coming, Christ comes to destroy the Antichrist and the armies of the world that have come to fight against him. Then he eventually goes on to reign for 1,000 years with the saints on the earth. But this doesn't seem to harmonize with what Yeshua is referring to in John chapter 14, where he speaks of himself coming again to take his people to himself and bringing them back to the Father's house in heaven. Some proponents of the post-tribulation rapture position have argued that John 14 does indeed harmonize with their position, and that they believe that at the second coming, Christ gathers his people to himself by rapturing them. But then they assert Christ eventually brings the raptured saints to the Father's house on the earth, which they claim is the New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven at the beginning of the millennium. However, Revelation 21 indicates that the holy city, which I believe is the Father's house, comes down from heaven after the millennium, when God creates the new heaven and earth. So my challenge to those of you who hold to a post-tribulation rapture is, how exactly does the teachings of Christ in John chapter 14 harmonize with your position? When do you believe Christ's promise to come and get his disciples to bring them back to the Father's house will be fulfilled? How does that harmonize with the events of the second coming that doesn't seem to include Christ returning back to the Father's house in heaven, but instead entails him coming to reign on the earth with his people?